It is my pleasure to introduce our next speaker, Dr. Krista Robinson. She's an assistant professor and director of the Motivation, Identity, Learning, and Education in STEM Lab in the Department of Education and Counseling Psychology at McGill University. Pretty good acronym as well. In her research, she examines how and why students' motivation changes over time. She investigates developmental patterns of motivation, including identity, interest, and competence beliefs during adolescence and early adulthood, along with classroom practices and interventions that support students' social-emotional development. The ultimate aim of her work is to expand opportunities for the pursuit of students' valued goals by informing the design of more equitably and motivationally supportive classrooms. So I actually just met Kristy on Wednesday, and I already feel like we're friends. I already have our fondest memory. So yesterday, we were at a live lab tour, and they needed a volunteer to play on their Disc Lavier piano. And Kristy and I did a duet of Heart and Soul. And just in case my memories of the quality of our performance ever fades, we actually have a recording of our exact velocity movements on the piano, so we'll always have that. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Kristy Robinson.
Thank you so much for that fantastic intro. It was a treasured memory yesterday. Super fun to try that technology and, to play such a difficult piece, demonstrating our virtuosity was real. Yes. So like our keystrokes, other people can learn from those, right? All right. So thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate the invitation to be here, and many thanks to the wonderful team of people who are making this possible. And thank you for being here. You've been doing such a great job paying attention for the 2 days that we've had so far, or a day and a half rather. I'll try and keep your attention a little further today. In this presentation, my plan is to highlight some takeaways from my research on changes in university students' motivational beliefs in large introductory STEM courses. So I'll focus in particular on how instructors enact motivationally supportive teaching practices in both online and in-person lecture courses, with implications for how we might consider and reconsider interventions in education, and how we think about those interventions. So the title of my talk is Motivated Students and Motivating Classrooms, Socio-Emotional Processes as Opportunities for Student Success. So what do I mean by socio-emotional? Well, my particular focus under that broad umbrella is motivation. So in the talk today, we'll first touch on, what is motivation? I think we all kind of have an intuitive understanding of how we think about motivation, what it is or what it isn't. I'll get into what I'm talking about and what most motivation researchers are talking about when we refer to motivation, and why should we care about it, right? Why is it important? Then we'll pivot to how does motivation typically change? You might have some intuitions about this, and I'm guessing they're probably right, but I'm going to give you some evidence, and you might think I'm going overboard, but I care about this a lot, so we're going to talk about that for a bit. We'll talk about how we can support students' motivation, which is probably the main reason you're here today. You want to know what we can do, so we'll go over some design principles and sprinkle in some specific examples from the wonderful instructors I've been lucky enough to work with. And then we will go to some conclusions and takeaways. And I want to warn you right now, too, that I'm going to ask you for a little bit of participation. So one way that you can participate, too, throughout is you can share answers to my questions that I'm going to pose, or just your general reactions to this talk using the hashtag for this symposium, as well as the hashtag I came up with for this talk, Motivate EdCog. All right. So what is motivation? We define motivation broadly as the process of initiating and sustaining goal-directed behavior. So there's a lot to unpack there, right? But we'll stick with that for now. And we also want to emphasize that motivation influences the quality of behavior. So it's what energizes us to start, to keep going, and to engage in a particular way. So if success is flying a plane to our desired destination, think of motivation as the engines providing the power necessary to get you in the air and to keep you there. So we can pause here for a moment and maybe think of a time when you felt really motivated to engage in a difficult task, or it could be a time when you were not that motivated to engage in a difficult task. So why did you start working on it? Why did you keep going? And why did you adopt the particular strategies that you did? If you're having a hard time thinking of a time when you were engaging or motivated to engage in a difficult task, the one I always use with my classes is cleaning up, right? Cleaning up your home or cleaning up your living space, maybe just making your bed. It can be kind of difficult sometimes. So what makes you start, what makes you continue, and what makes you do it in a particular way? So one other kind of myth that people often adopt with motivation is that we think it might just be one thing, right? We either have it or we don't. But motivation actually isn't just one thing. It's made up of many different beliefs and thought processes that work together to energize you. You can think of these as being like the many different parts that enable a plane engine to work. And so the way that we can kind of categorize these beliefs is under these two questions. So motivation is based on individuals' beliefs about, can I do this? And why do I want to do this? And we really need good answers to both of these questions in order to give our best to a task. So students need to be able to answer these questions really well in order to give their best to a task. So let's go deeper into what are some of the specific beliefs that answer these questions. Under the bucket of, can I do this? The biggest and most important one is competence beliefs. So these are often referred to by like self-efficacy, self-concept, expectancy for success. These are some of the keywords you'll see in the literature on competence beliefs. These are one of the biggest determinants of students' achievement, in motivational determinants of achievement, I should say. Under the can I do this category, we also have effort beliefs and mindsets. So students' beliefs about the role of effort in their successes and their beliefs about ability. Does it change or does it not change? We also have some environmental or contextual concerns. So students, they might feel very efficacious and competent on their own, but they might see some barriers in their environment to enacting that competence and getting to success. So we have to acknowledge that as well. Under the why do I want to do this side of the beliefs, we have task values, such as the usefulness of the material or a student's interest, or we can also refer to these as intrinsic or extrinsic motivation, so more external reasons versus internal reasons for engaging in the material. Achievement goals also fall under this category of beliefs. So if I'm there to really learn and improve myself, or if I'm there to kind of outperform others, look smart, or avoid looking stupid, those could be some of my achievement goals. And belonging and identity concerns also fall under this category. So do I feel like I'm a person who belongs in this field? Am I a person who really identifies with this subject matter? So it looks like my animations might be kind of funny here, but in a minute I'm going to start zooming in on competence beliefs and task values in particular, because that's what a lot of my research is focused on. And that's because these two types of beliefs are assumed to be the most important and proximal predictors of students' achievement-related choices and behaviors. Okay, and in case you're not convinced of this already, we'll just spend a little moment here talking about why is motivation important. Well, we really need motivation for a lot of really important outcomes like engagement and persistence, higher order strategy use, learning and achievement, emotional well-being, and major and career choices. And I would add too that it's an important outcome in and of itself. So yes, we need motivation to get these sort of external markers of success, but I think it's also important that we kind of leave classes feeling efficacious, like we can do it and that we have good reasons for being there. So let's move to how does motivation typically change? So we'll look at something we're all kind of familiar with. I'm guessing you may have seen this illustration before, but we often start a semester or a year or even just a goal with grand ambitions of how well it's going to go, how much effort we're going to put in. It's going to be wonderful, right? And then we sometimes find ourselves limping into the finish line rather than completing our grand ambition. So we've all experienced this before, right? But lo and behold, when I look in the literature, I didn't see a ton of empirical evidence of this. And so I wanted to document this more carefully so I could figure out, for example, what kinds of supports do students actually need? When do they need those supports? And who are the students who might need it most? Because if those changes are not kind of uniform across these different beliefs, or they're happening at particular times in a semester or a year or studies in general, then we want to target our supports to be most efficient and most effective, right? So how do I typically study this? We'll talk about that next. I typically have focused on university STEM students. And as Dr. Hard mentioned before, these science, technology, engineering, and math fields can be very polarizing settings for people's motivational beliefs, right? We've all heard that statement of like, oh, I'm just not a math person, or, I'm not a scientist. So I've focused in particular on these settings. The data sources I use most are longitudinal surveys. So I ask students a few times across several years or across a single semester about their motivational beliefs. And I also rely on academic records, of course, with their consent. And we get video and observations of teaching, and we've started doing interviews more recently too, to kind of form a holistic picture of what is happening and then how is that affecting students. And my analytic approaches, I primarily am a quantitative researcher, so I use structural equation modeling and mixture modeling are my favorite methods. But more and more I've recognized the importance of also complementing that with rich descriptions and more contextual information about the why and when and how of what's going on and why is it working or not in particular contexts. Okay, so like I said, I use surveys, and I think one of the best ways to show you what I do is to have you take one of my surveys. So I've made a very shortened version. It's only 8 questions. This is going to help illustrate the specific kinds of beliefs that I study, and this will show you really concretely what a research participant experiences in my studies. So this very brief survey, 8 questions. You can use the bit.ly or you can use the QR code, and I'll give you a moment here to answer these questions. And if you'd rather not follow the link, that's totally okay. I have the questions up here, and you can just reflect on them. So I've modified my typical survey items, right, to discuss reasons why you might be here today, right? So which of these questions did you agree with? Do more than one of these describe your reasons for being here today, or for not wanting to be here, right? Those costs as a balance to our values. So it's okay if you haven't quite finished. We'll start discussing though. So the survey you just took asked you about 8 different motivational beliefs. So I asked you about your expectancy for success. This is similar to self-efficacy, your confidence that you can learn. That's what that is. In the pink here, I asked you about your values for this task of attending the symposium. Those are in pink here, so they could be, you might identify really strongly with learning about recent advances in education research. You might just think it's really useful for your day-to-day goals, or you might just be interested, it might be fun. And I asked you about costs as a balance to those values. Sometimes we can have some kind of associated costs that we think, oh man, I really like this, I really need this, but it's also kind of hard for me to get away from my other responsibilities. It takes a lot of effort for me to learn about these things, or I'm really concerned about the psychological or emotional costs of engaging. So these are the kinds of questions I ask students. And as you might notice, you may have agreed with more than one of these, you may have disagreed with more than one. So your high or low levels of these various beliefs show how complex our motivations can be for any particular task, and so how complex students' motivations can be for a particular task. So let's walk through some graphs of what some typical responses might look like and what I often see when I look at profiles of students' motivation. So we're going to stick with this color scheme of the task values being in red or pink and the costs in gray, and here expectancy for success is in black. So if you feel confident and you endorse some of those values on the survey while disagreeing with the costs for the most part, you have what we call a positively motivated profile. That's usually a great sign. Students who endorse a profile like this, they're just positively motivated, and that's going to be really beneficial, right? That's what we're looking for. If you feel confident, you have reasons that you value your participation, but you also endorse some of these costs, and you have more of a mixed motivational profile. You might think that's bad, but actually, for a lot of the outcomes we look at, this can be equally beneficial for students to have even a mixed profile, because they're kind of acknowledging, yes, there's some cost to it, but it's still worthwhile to me. And then maybe you just agreed with the costs and disagreed with the other items, and I'm super surprised you're here. But so students who find academic tasks to be costly and not valuable and who don't feel confident they can succeed, these are the students who are most at risk for failure, for disengagement, and for lower well-being, as you would expect, right? So coming back to the purpose of this part of the presentation today, think back to your answers on the survey. Do you think there's any way that your beliefs might change over the course of this hour or over the course of the next week or month, looking back on your experiences here? What we see in students is yes, their motivational beliefs do change. They can and they do. So on the surveys I use in my research, I actually ask more than one question for each of these beliefs. This is so we can have multiple indicators that triangulate to help us signal what students really believe from noise or measurement error. This is something educational psychologists really care about. Measurement's very important. So these sample items I'm going to display for you are in some cases a bit different from the actual measures we used in each specific study, but I'm showing you to illustrate. So this first study I'm going to talk to you about, in this study we asked engineering majors about their motivation at 3 different time points. This was just before beginning their engineering studies at university, at the end of their first year of university, and at the end of their second year of university. So expectancy for success, or students' confidence that they'll succeed in engineering, started out high just before beginning university and then significantly declined over time on average. We also asked them about 3 different values for engineering studies: attainment value, or their identification with engineering; utility value, or the usefulness of the content for their goals; and interest value, how much they enjoy learning about engineering. All 3 values significantly declined over time, with attainment value or identity-related value declining more slowly than the other values. So students were tending to lose interest in engineering. They were thinking of engineering studies as being less and less useful for their goals, and they personally identified less and less with engineering on average as time went on. And lastly, we also asked them about their perceptions of the costs involved in pursuing engineering. I've grayed out emotional costs here just because this wasn't in this particular study, but in line with what we've seen already, all the costs significantly increased over time, with effort cost increasing more rapidly than psychological cost. So students viewed their engineering studies as more and more costly to their other valued opportunities, to the amount of effort they had to put in, and to their psychological health. So putting this all together, on average, these trajectories showed maladaptive patterns of development. And you probably won't be shocked to know this is corroborating a number of other studies looking at motivational beliefs in math, motivational beliefs in language arts over several years for primary and secondary students, and then in my own work, looking at science students across 4 years, looking at chemistry students within a single semester, and our more recent study, which I'll show you in a moment. So these changes also may look really small. You may be like, does that even matter, right? But they actually do have important consequences. So the main outcomes in this particular study were we looked at their grades and their major persistence. Did they stay in engineering or did they leave? Students with slower declines in expectancy for success and value and slower increases in costs actually achieved higher grades and were less likely to leave the engineering major. So essentially, they had a benefit, right? Because they're staying more stable or they're actually increasing in their positive motivational beliefs. And what I found really encouraging here was the students who took a supportive gateway course in their first year, as recommended by the program, right? This program says, oh, we have this great course, you should take it in your first semester. Those students, that course had a stabilizing effect on their motivation. So they had higher task values, higher expectancy for success, and slower increases in costs as well. So essentially those who took that course in their first semester as recommended received a motivational benefit compared to those who took the course later, even controlling for different levels of preparation. But your next question, well, right, our experiences make a difference. But your next question might be, well, how much can one course really shift students' motivational beliefs? Can it really make a difference? Well, you might or might not be surprised to learn that we actually see really similar patterns in the short term. Students' motivation shows maladaptive declines and increases, even in the short term, in a single semester. And these changes then predict their achievement, their choices moving forward. So the good news is that in courses where instructors really care about this, really try to support students' motivation, we've actually seen more flat or even positive trajectories of motivation, even when they're teaching remotely due to the pandemic. So we've seen some good examples of effective instruction that I'll highlight. So just a brief note about the trajectories I've shown you thus far. I'm showing you means, right? And so means are not necessarily where any one particular student's experience lie. So if we plot individual trajectories along with the average, it's going to look more like this, right? So how can we make sense of that? We're not teaching to a mean, right? We're teaching individual students. So in fact, when we use a technique called mixture modeling, which I think is really fun, we can start to identify subgroups in the data with qualitatively distinct patterns of change and start to narrow down, okay, who's doing pretty well and who can we maybe target for additional support. So let me show you what some of those subgroups can look like. Focusing on some courses where we know the instructors are very good at their jobs, they're very motivationally supportive, they have great reputations for supporting students and even inviting them into these fields of study where we would traditionally think of the intro course as being a weed out course. So these are, oh yes, 2 chemistry courses. This was in fall 2019, so before the pandemic, they're teaching in person, right? And these are dedicated, effective instructors who, they're doing research with us because they really care about teaching and they want to improve all the time. And these are newer results, right, published recently. So if you joined the journal club, you've already seen this. I'll just touch on some brief highlights. All right, so in these courses, 11% of students were classified as increasingly confident chemists because they had fairly low confidence that actually increased throughout the semester. And they had moderately high and stable identification with chemistry, right? So they feel like they really identify with chemistry. They're not quite sure they're confident, but the class was able to effectively increase their confidence throughout the semester. Another 11% of students were classified as moderately confident chemists, as they had similarly high and fairly stable identification with chemistry, along with moderate levels of confidence that they could succeed in chemistry. The third and largest group had levels of both expectancy for success and attainment value that were remarkably high and stable. So this suggests to us that the majority of students had very high quality motivation throughout the semester. That's good news. And finally, we had 15% of students that were classified as confident non-chemists because they were confident throughout the semester, but they didn't really identify with chemistry. Like, I could take it or leave it. And in fact, they appeared to disidentify with chemistry throughout the semester. They felt less and less like it was really reflective of who they were. So we can use techniques like mixture modeling to narrow down in onto students who are doing okay and students who might need some additional support. And later on, I'll show you some predictors of these. All right, moving into how do we support students' motivation? This is the main focus of today. Students' motivation tends to decline. We've learned that. So what are some really effective instructors doing to try to mitigate some of those declines and try to actually boost students' motivation in some cases? And I think what a lot of us wonder in particular these days is how can we support students' motivation when they're learning online, learning remotely? Students' motivation, supporting students' motivation has become an even more pressing priority when we're dealing with things like Zoom fatigue and social barriers. It's not easy to interact or to have students interact with each other. It's hard for us to gauge understanding because we're not seeing our students in real time sometimes. Accessibility can be a concern. Students are suffering in their general mental and emotional well-being, and they have many other demands on their attention when they're at home or in some various location trying to learn, right? So this has become kind of an increasing priority for us. All right, so before I dive in to this, I'd love to know briefly what you think about this. So thinking about your own experience as an instructor or even as a student currently or in the past, what's a word or phrase that describes very motivating instruction? So this could be a quality of the instructor, something about the activities they plan, or something about others in the environment. So you can raise your hand or call out, or you can actually just tweet about this. What's motivating instruction look like to you? I'd love to hear it. Yeah. Enthusiastic. Yes, love it. Engaging. Yep. What else? Relationship building. Curiosity. Passion. Yes. Seen a lot of that here. Okay, great. Yes, I totally agree. These are awesome ideas, and I think you'll see a lot of those reflected in these principles we're about to go over. So I'm going to first sketch out kind of the broad conceptual framework I'm working with. This is derived from a few different theories, and this was my doctoral advisor who kind of synthesized these theories together. We're talking about situated expectancy value theory, achievement goal theory, and self-determination theory in particular. And what she and her colleagues did was figure out where do these different motivational theories overlap in their recommendations for how we should teach. The broad assumptions here are that motivation is a necessary precursor to success in school, which we've talked about already, and that contexts can shape students' motivation directly, like this, but also that students' perceptions of the context are really key intermediary between the environment and its impacts on their motivation. This is like a very crude model, right? Because we know that contexts are complex and causal mechanisms are really hard to kind of sort out. But this is a very broad sketch of how we think these processes unfold. So the important thing we're focusing on here is that teachers can do things that increase the likelihood that students will adopt beneficial motivational beliefs. So what are those things they can do? To answer that question, I'll introduce these principles that are distilled from major motivation theories, particularly those I mentioned on the previous slide. And I display them in this way to highlight that they're interconnected, right? So a teacher who does one is usually doing at least another one of these, and implementing them by doing one principle by itself won't be as beneficial as implementing multiple, right? So let's go through together. First, we'll talk about the principle of supporting competence, and the broader idea here is to support competence through well-designed instruction, challenging work, and encouraging and informational feedback. So how can we support competence? Here are some ideas. First, you want to provide opportunities for challenge balanced with opportunities for students to succeed. So success experience are the best way to build confidence, right? So if students have lots of low stakes opportunities to succeed, that's really great, really beneficial to them, even as you're trying to keep them challenged. It's not too easy, not too hard, right? This fosters confidence or the belief that they can do it. And what we also want to do is foster not only the belief, but their actual competence at the same time. So, right, just helping them develop better study strategies is one easy way to do this. Encouraging students to attribute success to effort and strategy use rather than luck or task difficulty or low or high ability. That's another way that we can shape students' perceptions of competence. And of course, we want to foster the belief that ability is changeable, right? The growth mindset. So this, some of this data that I'm going to show you now is derived from a student project in which she interviewed effective instructors of these large intro courses and asked them, how are you thinking about this? What are some strategies that you've used and that you feel have been effective for supporting students' confidence? So let me go back here. So one of the ways that they do this is through student-centered and problem-based learning, and that really allows them to adapt instruction to students' levels of preparedness. So there might be students who are really prepared and they can engage in some of the more difficult questions and difficult problems. Then you have students who need a little extra support. So what we've seen is the instructors are actually walking around, the instructors themselves as well as their undergrad mentors and TAs. So they're adapting the problems to students' different levels of competence. Again, trying to give them lots of success experiences. And those are low stakes, right? Because they're often during class and they're not graded. Another way that they support competence is through detailed feedback. So they give detailed feedback like through individualized emails sometimes. They find out who's doing really well and they'll send them emails and say, wow, it looks like you named a student, did really well on this, way to go. I really appreciate how much they might notice some really positive specific thing that they did. They also will target students who maybe didn't perform as well and email them individually and say, oh, here's some resources we can provide. Here are some things that you can do to improve your understanding of these concepts. And let's see. Oh, and quiz discussions. In some of the classes, they give students opportunities to discuss the quizzes. This allows them to learn challenging tasks from more advanced peers or peers who understand it better. The students really respond to that well. Next principle is to enhance autonomy through opportunities for student decision-making and direction. So what can we do to enhance autonomy? We can provide or just highlight opportunities for choice. You might be surprised by how many opportunities for choice you already have in your course. If you can just highlight those and play those up and be like, ooh, I'm giving you all this autonomy. We don't want to give autonomy just kind of hairy-carry. We want to choose these carefully to be meaningful to students, right? Autonomy should be selected to kind of align with what students kind of care about and what's appropriate for their developmental level, right? We don't want to give kindergartners every choice to do everything. And we can kind of guess at what university students might be able to handle. And we'll talk about like a little bit later, spoiler alert, what Dr. Hard talked about, which is like, well, you can try it and gather data and see how it works, right? Another way we can enhance autonomy is to provide opportunities for students to share their perspectives. This can go a long way, right? It can be as simple as like stopping for a moment and being like, how are you guys doing? Trying to notice how they're feeling or anticipate how they might feel. In the large intro courses, this can just look like, oh, I know that sometimes these exams are anxiety producing, right? You're acknowledging their perspectives. And then if you can take time to ask them through little surveys, through brief Q&As to show that you care about their perspectives, that's really wonderful. And then a third way is to give rationale and explanations for why we're doing what we're doing. That also is really helpful, especially as the students get older, right? Their developmental ability to understand what's going on, they want to know, why are we doing this assignment? Why is class structured this way? Why are we spending so much time on practice problems? Is this beneficial to me? If you have these really great rationales for why you're doing things, you can share them briefly, and that can really help students feel kind of on board, right? And that they're a part of this. And lastly, you want to avoid controlling language. I'm sure nobody is going out there being like, you must, I'm going to control you. But we can sometimes like accidentally slip in some controlling language of like, well, you just really have to do this. Like, just do it. So we want to try to use more autonomous language where we're providing those rationales and inviting them to go along with you on this journey of learning. So an example of swapping out some controlling language here, like we could say, oh, you have to do this assignment, full stop, versus this assignment is required because it will help you develop this specific skill that you'll need for this specific goal. And then you can ask to think about, what do you think? Let's brainstorm about different ways to approach this assignment to get their perspectives, right? Okay. Third principle here is to emphasize select personally relevant, interesting activities that provide opportunities for identification and active involvement. So how do we do that? First, if you can, it's really great if you can choose activities that align with students' interests. And I'll highlight in a moment how our chemistry instructors have done that. You can do quick polls or surveys at the beginning of the semester to try to gauge their interests. Maybe you just find out what their majors are, right? And you can try to tailor different activities or practice questions to their different areas of interest. Encouraging discussion of how concepts and skills are important or relevant to students. There's some really interesting research on directly communicated utility and student-generated utility. So for different kinds of students, it might be more beneficial for me, for example, to say, learning this concept is important because, and then mention a relevance connection or mention what future goal it's important for. And for other students, it might be really beneficial to ask them to generate that themselves, right? Write a letter to a family member as to why this could be applicable in their lives, or write an essay to a future student talking about how you can apply this material in day-to-day life. Third, we can provide opportunities for active involvement. And I'm sure a lot of you are already on board with this, but anytime that we can get students to kind of mix up the listening with any kind of hands-on activity or participation. So this can be a lab experiment, this can be a problem-solving exercise, this could be a group discussion. Of course, it should be thoughtful, right? It should have a purpose. But those opportunities for active involvement can also boost students' interest. So what do faculty say? Oh yeah, you can see this concept in action when you take aspirin. That's an example of a relevance connection. Our instructors really like to tell stories about their own lives or about historical chemists or just various day-to-day connections that are really helpful. So what do faculty say about strategies to promote student interest? Well, instructors said they could connect concepts to real life by, for example, highlighting news articles that connect with course content, like nutrition and health concerns, things like that, or how the concepts they're learning will be needed for future studies, future courses, or future careers. One way they did this was with the McGill Chemist series. Students were assigned to learn about ongoing projects at McGill for McGill professors or McGill graduate students, and then they posted about them on social media. And that was really successful in getting students to see, oh, this is why I need to know this, is because later on I could be studying these really cool topics like these cutting edge researchers. Another way that I thought was really interesting that the instructors framed this as an opportunity to boost interest was that they actively acknowledged and debunked things like gender stereotypes. So they'd say things like women can code, like simple things like that. And these courses actually have a really great reputation for inviting women into computer science as a result. Rather than weeding out students, this course actually has students changing their major or their minor to computer science after taking it, because they really take this on and they make it a really inclusive environment. The instructors also provide lots of opportunities for interaction through group work and peer feedback. So even when they're teaching online, they try to build these in. So they might have a pre-recorded lecture, but then they make sure that there's also time for live tutorials where students can interact with TAs, with the instructor, and with each other. Our fourth principle here is to emphasize learning and understanding while de-emphasizing performance, competition, and social comparison. This is one that I've seen maybe the most resistance to, or the most maybe misconceptions about among STEM faculty. I work with engineers most closely when I was in graduate school, and they really loved to do these design competitions in class, which are really cool, and they're probably really real, right, to how engineers operate. But they also can have kind of a negative side effect of dampening students' motivation or putting them into a less beneficial type of motivation. Performance goals, they can be motivating in the short term, but they kind of be detrimental, they can be stressful, they can be anxiety producing, and they can chip away at students' desire to really master the content and focus on learning rather than competing. So how do we emphasize learning? One thing you can do is recognize growth towards goals and learning objectives rather than grades and social comparisons, right? If you want to focus the student back on their own individual learning journey. Like, are you understanding this better than you did before, rather than comparing them against like the class average or the best performing students? The classic example that we try to avoid, right, is like posting the names of the top performers. We would never do that, hopefully, in this day and age. But the main idea is to downplay the social comparisons. Another way that we can do this is to provide encouraging informational specific feedback and opportunities to revise. So, examples of this are maybe students have 2 opportunities to take a quiz, or they can turn in an assignment after they've revised it to reclaim some of the credit, but more importantly to improve their mastery. So how you frame that is kind of important, right? If you're focusing them on, oh, we want you to get the most points you possibly can, then that might not be as beneficial as saying, oh, we want you to learn as much as you possibly can from this opportunity to revise. And last, we want to recognize students' efforts and strategies. So rewarding them or just praising them to say, oh, I really appreciate how much effort you're putting into learning. I can see that you are using this strategy. Maybe we can tweak that, right? Praising their effort and strategy use instead of focusing on praising just the outcome, right? The performance. So an example here is maybe you're discussing an exam, the results of an exam. You can direct students' attention toward which kinds of questions were harder and which were easier, and that way help direct your study efforts to areas where you need to improve, right? So you're focusing on a score as an indicator of learning, which is what it should be, right? But we can often lose sight of that. Students really lose sight of that when they're really focused on the points. So the more we can point them back to the learning and the purposes of those assessments, the better. And this is one of my memes that I like to share on social media to translate this. What do we say to social comparisons? Not today. So let's give this a try. Oh, this is not displaying very well, is it? Well, I can read them out to you. We'll just focus on these 3 then. This is from a really interesting study led by Elizabeth Canning and colleagues. These are some examples of what to avoid, right? These messages signal to students that they either have the ability or they don't. And the important thing is to look smart, right? So maybe we're talking about prerequisites for the course and we say, if you've not mastered the concepts in the previous course, you should consider dropping this course. What a message, right? Maybe we're talking about quizzes. We say, based on previous semesters, students who don't do well in quizzes usually also struggle on the exams. So if you do worse than most people on the quiz, you should consider dropping. We can talk about exams in a similar way. I don't give partial credit, so your answer is either right or wrong. So I want us to take a stab at this for a moment. How might we send a different message about learning and growth when we're talking about prerequisites, when we're talking about quizzes, when we're talking about exams? That might be a policy issue. We might change the policy, or we might just communicate differently about that policy. So I'm going to pause here for a moment, maybe jot down some notes about how you could talk about, pick one of these, and how could you talk about it a little differently to communicate an emphasis on mastery, on growth, on intrapersonal development. Okay, let's pause there for a second. I would love to hear maybe 1 or 2. I would actually love to hear all of your ideas. So if you'd please tweet them out too, I would love to see it. I'm going to follow up on Twitter and be sure to answer and then talk to people who've communicated that way. But what ideas did you have about how we could communicate an emphasis on mastery and on growth? Kind of nerve-wracking to volunteer, right? Yes. Awesome. Yes, it's as simple as that. Saying if you've struggled on the quizzes, here's some ways that you can improve. Here's some resources you can use, or here's how you can figure out where to focus your studies. That's a great idea. I love it. Maybe one more? Yes. You read my mind. If you have not mastered the concepts in the previous course, please see me for resources that can help you get caught up. That was my exact same idea. Wonderful. Yeah. So these might actually sometimes require more work, but like we saw in Dr. Hard's presentation, it might not actually. If you're worried about the workload creep of trying to help students have the resources, consider that often the message is the most important thing, right? If I just say, I care about you, I would like you to succeed, and I want you to learn, you can point them to resources that your expertise probably has a deep understanding of where they can go, right? And that might be all that they need to continue and to feel like they should learn. For this second one idea is the quizzes show me how well you're understanding the material and whether I need to review certain concepts, right? So you can say, look, I actually will adapt my instruction to how well people are doing and where I see some pain points in understanding. And then if you're struggling, you should seek additional help to grow your understanding. Exams, you can't see it here, but it basically just says, I award partial credit if I can see that your problem solving is in the right direction, or if you've got part of the problem correct. The last one I do want to mention, it's cut off here, but it's about use of resources. And I want to mention this because we see this in our data as being really important to students. How instructors talk about the use of resources can be really impactful for them. Students mention it when we just ask them broadly about what's helpful in the course, they'll volunteer this information. So a lot of these large intro courses have TAs and undergrad mentors and special study sessions, as well as maybe the teaching and learning services has dedicated space and people hired to help students succeed at chemistry or a lot of these courses, right? How the instructors talk about those resources really matters. Because I could say, if you're not doing well, the weaker students will use these resources. So you're kind of signaling that if you use the resources, it's because you have low ability, right? And we don't want students to actively avoid using the resources because it shows that they're not good at it. Instead, if you just actively encourage everyone to use the resources, you can say, these are pretty difficult concepts. You're going to struggle at some point in this class. You're normalizing the struggle, and I invite everyone to become familiar with these resources and know how to use them and use them as often as possible. It can always benefit people to use those extra resources. Okay, moving on past this really bad table. The last principle is to support students' sense of belonging among each other and with their instructor, both. So you, as an instructor, want to do everything you can to develop warm, caring relationships And that might be impossible. It might seem impossible with like a class of 500 students before you, but you can do a lot to communicate broad warmth and caring to everyone with just a little bit of effort, right? You can try to learn some of the students' names. You can try to ask them to answer questions. You can be really warm and caring. There's a lot of ways to communicate this. A little goes a long way. You want to show your enthusiasm for the field and for the specific content. It makes you human, right? To be like, I'm so excited about this, and to tell stories about your own journey with the subject matter. And you want to provide opportunities for peer connection. So we're running out of time. But together, like one thing you may immediately notice about these principles is if you're implementing one of them, you're probably also implementing at least one other, possibly even at the same time. And that's something we see in our data, right? So when an instructor is providing an opportunity for students to get actively involved, or they're highlighting the relevance of the course material to students' lives, they're also often being very enthusiastic, or they're showing how much they care about students' learning and growth. So these principles are not necessarily separable actions, but rather broader patterns of behavior. And they really shouldn't be an extra task for instructors to add on to what they're already doing, because you're already doing lots of stuff already that communicates why students should be putting in effort and engaging in learning. So to give you some brief evidence of the effectiveness of these principles, let's come back to this slide that we saw earlier. So students who perceived their instructor as making more relevance connections between the course content and real life were less likely to be confident non-chemists compared to the other three groups. So in other words, students perceiving more relevance were more likely to identify as chemists. So it kind of separated the chemists from the non-chemists. And then perceived instructor warmth and enthusiasm appeared to distinguish groups with higher or increasing confidence from students who had lower or decreasing confidence. So students who perceived their instructor as being more personable were more likely to be classified as confident non-chemists or high and stable confident chemists compared to this moderately confident chemists. Okay, we are going to skip ahead to, I just want to show you this one slide. I just want to show you how instructors, this is a kind of a side note, but because online instruction's on our minds, I want to show you how instructors adapted their motivational supports from when transitioning from 2019 in-person instruction to 2020 pandemic instruction. We saw that instructors used more relevant statements and more enthusiasm in 2020 in their videos compared to when they were teaching in person. This is per 10-minute segment of instruction, and they used a little less autonomy support. But we didn't really see differences in student motivation, except for at the very beginning of the semester before instruction had even started, right? So students might have had kind of lower expectations, but overall they did pretty well in terms of the motivational impact of the courses. All right, so to finish with some conclusions and takeaways, in popular conceptualizations and in a lot of research, we've really focused on motivation as a quality of the individual, right? You have it or you don't, and it's something that students are responsible for having and maintaining. But newer conceptualizations of motivation acknowledge that it's a very social and contextually bound process. So yes, I'm motivated by who I am, I'm motivated by what I bring to the table, but my context, my classroom, my assignments, my teacher, my classmates, they provide lots of opportunities for me to stay motivated, to become more motivated, or even lose my motivation. So why should we be focused at all on trying to support students' motivation? Well, because it can change. And guess what? On average, those changes are not looking good. So we're going to skip over this for now. We won't talk about the field as much. I'll skip to final thoughts so we have time for questions. But what I want to note here is that teachers are already doing things that support or unintentionally undermine students' motivation. So figuring out what's already going on is perhaps the most important step in designing motivational supports for students in a particular context. And it doesn't have to be an extra to-do list item to support motivation in addition to teaching. Effective motivationally supportive instruction makes teachers and students' jobs easier. And from my perspective, students' achievements are only one important outcome, as I mentioned at the beginning, right? Social emotional development matters too. So these motivation outcomes are what we should care about as well. And as Dr. Hard mentioned, gathering really small-scale data about your students, This can be formal or informal, right? You could just have them raise their hands. You can see their faces. That counts sometimes as data, right? Of effectiveness of these instructional moves can help a lot, really, in designing and adapting effective motivational supports. Okay, so motivation is complex. Motivation is multifaceted and malleable. And the design principles that I've mentioned are a great place to start. But I really encourage you to consider adopting sort of a rapid prototyping approach. It's not just for engineers and for scientists, to figure out what's really working for your particular context and students. I'm going to thank my research lab group. This is the current group of grad students and collaborators and funders. And thank you very much for being here. Open it up for questions.
Thanks so much, Kristy. And so one thing I just wanted to comment about, like promoting resources and adding in messages of like growth. I think it could be really challenging, like for say a brand new instructor who's just trying to get things out the door, right? And like I'll use myself as an example. In my very first year of setting up the introductory psychology, it was a challenge for me to just get the content. And in my case, I had to build these online web modules. And like when I look back at them now, it's really embarrassing to just see how it was just like I was just shoveling content, and it was really I was just so driven by time.
Yeah.
And now I look, Michelle, Dr. Caddy, and I, like, we're kind of fine tuning, and we're adding like all of these things based on like your research and of others. So for example, when we're talking about the action potential, it's very mechanistic, it's very detailed. At the end of that specific unit, we come on camera and say, like, I don't care if your name is Hubel or Weasel. It would be completely normal for you to be feeling a little bit overwhelmed and needing to go back over this, right? And we put a lot of those messages in. I've heard from a lot of students who said, you know what? That makes me feel so great.
Yeah.
It makes it like I'm not the only one that thought that this was confusing.
Right. Normalizing.
So it's a long way of asking, like, what advice to give to new instructors who are like, they're just trying to get things out the door. How do they take all of this into account?
It's a really great question. And teaching is hard. It's really hard work. And especially when you're teaching a course for the first time or you're doing kind of a redesign, the focus is on the content, right? And making sure you're covering the content, just getting it out there. So I definitely don't think you should try to like implement everything and be perfect at supporting students' motivation. I give workshops on this for teachers, and really the goal of any kind of engagement with this is to identify one thing that you could maybe sprinkle in, or one thing that you could tweak. Maybe you have a syllabus policy, right? That's like, I don't really allow partial credit, or I don't allow revisions. You could change one. You could have one assignment where you allow a revision. You could message about that and say, oh, because I really care about your learning, your ability to revise and grow, I'm going to allow you to revise this assignment based on my feedback. That can go a long way. I think a little goes a long way is the message. And so as you're developing your teaching, as we always all are, right, figuring out one thing to tweak or one thing that you think will be really high impact. And I think really thinking about what's the most important lever or pain point, thinking about your own students, is a great place to start.
I think the hardest situation would be you're hired to teach one course once, and it's a completely brand new prep. I mean, I think that's the worst case scenario.
Yeah.
But if you happen to be in a more fortunate situation where you're teaching the course more than once, and this is what I encourage new faculty members, like, think of it as a long game. Like, think about like every year making small incremental improvements. And then, the third time that you teach it, you're looking back, you could already see the difference. But exactly, I don't think like a mistake of like, sometimes instructors make, well-intentioned instructors, like trying to do everything at once. Yeah.
And so I think if there's nothing else you can do, because you're just really focused on that, like getting through the content, just being warm and occasionally being like, we're in this together and I want you to learn. I think that's maybe the first one to attack.
So another question I just wanted to ask you too is connecting to what I commented about after Devin's presentation. Have you thought about drawing the connection between motivation and then mental health and well-being, like in your teaching?
Yeah, so I'm not an expert in mental health and well-being, so I'll like just comment on like my perceptions. But we do know that like people who are more confident and that feel like they have a reason to be there, like it's really tied up with their own well-being. And right, if they don't have like great mental health and those kind of like if they don't feel kind of safe, they're not going to engage anyway, right? So one of my colleagues, actually Nathan Hall at McGill, he's been shifting his focus dramatically to use a motivational lens to look at well-being, things like burnout of teachers being a real area of interest of his. I think it's really important that we start to look at that alongside our other indicators. Like when I was in graduate school, everyone's like, well, you have to have achievement and then like a behavioral outcome. And that's how you get published, right? Is like you have, in addition to your survey measures, you have these indicators that people really care about, especially policymakers. Like they just want to know, like, does this help them get better grades and stay in the major? And yeah, we care about that. That's good. But I think it's really important to complement those with other indicators. So I started to measure also things like job satisfaction or life satisfaction after graduating from university, things like that. And we do see some ties, like these students who feel more competent during their science degree then go on to have jobs that they're more satisfied in and or feel just more satisfied with their lives, which I think is like kind of crazy that we see that, but we do.
Okay. All right. Thank you very much.